So, Daniel chapter 9, I thought we were going to get into the visions that he sees, some very unusual ones, but I found some stuff here right before that just really got my attention. So we're going to kind of cover just a couple of verses today. And so I'd like to begin reading at verse 20, and we'll go through verse 23. So this is after Daniel's been praying and before he begins to receive this revelation about the 70 weeks that we'll talk about. This is what comes right in between. It says, while I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my plea before the Lord my God for the holy hill of my God. Again, that's Zion, representing God's presence in Israel. While I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, it's an angel, whom I had seen in the vision at the first, came to me in swift flight, and at the time of the evening sacrifice. He made me understand, speaking with me and saying, O Daniel, I have now come out to give you insight and understanding. At the beginning of your pleas for mercy, a word went out, and I have come to tell it to you, for you are greatly loved. Therefore consider the word and understand the vision. So when you read that, you're supposed to understand the vision, Daniel. You would expect that everything from this point on, beginning about verse 24, is going to be really clear, right? Because that's what the angel says God wanted for Daniel. Consider the word and understand the vision. But when we get into this next week, in verse 24, it's going to be anything but clear. And just fair warning ahead of time, I am next week going to share some of what I believe it could be saying, what I believe it could be saying, but I am not going to tell you definitively what it means, because there are a lot of people, including many who are a lot smarter than me, who have other views, and so I'm going to just kind of share my perspective. But I didn't want to get into that tonight because there's something going on here in this introductory passage before we get into it, and I want to look at it because it kind of brings out the context of where we're going. So again, Daniel had been praying. We talked about this last week. He'd been confessing Israel's sins. He'd been talking about the fact that they were unworthy to receive God's blessing. And so that's where verse 20 comes in, where the angel Gabriel is sent by God to talk to Daniel. And it's almost like Daniel's surprised kind of by how quickly it happens. Look again at the beginning of verse 21. While I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the first, came to me, watch this, in swift flight. So like he's praying, and like, whoosh, this angel appears to him. And it's so sudden, the appearance, it's almost like, I'm not 100% sure if this is what it means, but it's almost like he seems to be interrupting Daniel's prayer, because it said, while I was, in verse 21, while I was speaking in prayer. In other words, while I was still talking to God. Suddenly this angel comes out of nowhere, and so there's this really fast response to his prayer. And then Gabriel explained to Daniel why he had been sent. Again, let's reread verse 22. He made me understand, speaking with me and saying, O Daniel, here's what Gabriel says, I have now come out to give you insight and understanding. Now, anytime you and I pray as followers of Jesus, we know that God hears us immediately, right? Now, the answer might be a long time in coming, right? But we know that God hears us. But in this case, Daniel is told instantly, he's given immediate reassurance that his prayer had been heard, and the question I would ask is why? Why did this happen? And I think part of it had to do with what Daniel was praying, and part of it had to do with why Daniel was praying it. Now, so last time I spent most of the lesson, the teaching time, talking about how he had been confessing Israel's sins. He'd been praying to God about how unworthy Israel was to be blessed, and why was that? Because Daniel had been studying the book of Jeremiah the prophet, and he had realized again that Israel's 70 years in captivity there in Babylon were about to come to an end. And essentially what he's praying for here is that he knows they're going to go back home, they're going to go back to their land, and he doesn't want Israel, the Jewish people, to fall back into the same sinful practices that got them into this mess in the first place. We spent a lot of time talking about that. So that's why he's confessing Israel's sin, saying, Lord, have mercy on us. Don't judge us harshly, because he knows they're still not going to be perfect even when they are out of Babylon and back home. And so suddenly this angel comes, sent by the Lord, quickly, right? And what this angel is doing now, through this vision that we're about to study next week, he's going to give Daniel further insight, because the temptation would have been to think, okay, we've had these 70 years of captivity in Babylon, and now God is done dealing with us because we're going to go back home. And what the angel is going to be talking about, we've already seen bits and pieces of it in previous chapters, is that there was much more that God was still going to do. The 70 years weren't the end of God's dealings with Israel. There was more that was going to happen, and Daniel didn't fully understand it. Have you ever looked at some of the charts or the illustrations about biblical prophecy where they describe it in terms of a mountain? And what they usually show you is mountains, laid out subsequent. And you're standing here, and you're looking at the first mountain, and because the first mountain is so big, that's all you can see. And you can't see there's another mountain behind it because the first mountain covers it, and there may be a third mountain or whatever. And essentially, I think kind of that's what's happening here. The only way that Daniel was going to see the subsequent mountains was by revelation. He couldn't see past what was in front of his eyes right there. And same thing if you climb a mountain, right? You've almost got to get to the peak of the first mountain and look over it. Oh, there's more, right? And so that's kind of what I believe is happening here. Now, Daniel, in general terms, already knew this in a basic sense, because he had been seeing visions about the future. We talked about the 4 beasts that he saw and how those applied to the future. But now God is going to give him more detail, beginning in verse 24, and even deeper insights. And then there's something here that's really, really interesting. This is kind of where I'm going to focus tonight, and I want to spend the majority of our time, because this really got my attention. The reason God chose Daniel as opposed to some other Jewish person, there were other faithful Jewish people in Babylon that God could have spoken to, but the reason he chose Daniel, I think, is very interesting. Let's go back to verse 23 and read the first part. The angel says, at the beginning of your pleas for mercy, in other words, your prayers, a word went out, and I have come to tell it to you. Now, you could stop there, right? But listen, here's what he says. I have come to tell it to you, for you are greatly loved. Isn't that interesting? It doesn't say God loved him more than he loved other people, but there was something about Daniel that God was seeing. There was something about Daniel that God, can I say it this way, God appreciated about him. You're greatly loved. There's other translations of the Bible that use the word esteemed, like God thought highly of Daniel. And I was thinking about that. Why is that in there? Because everything is in the Bible for a reason, right? There's no throwaway phrases in the Bible. If it's there, it means something. And I was thinking, why is that in there? And here's what I want to suggest to you. I think part of the reason, maybe not all of it, but part of the reason that God had such a special place in his heart, his consideration for Daniel, you can see it if you go back to verse 21. Let me read this to you. While I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the first, came to me in swift flight. Now here's a phrase I want to underline. At the time of the evening sacrifice. What he's referring to is the time that the sacrifice had been made every evening at the temple in Jerusalem. And it actually went back to a command that God gave to Israel even before there was a temple. Back when they were first preparing the tabernacle in the wilderness, and God commanded, well, a lot of things, but there were 2 sacrifices that God commanded to be offered every day, and it's in Exodus 29, verses 38 and 39. This is really early in Israel's history. Here's what God said. Now this is what you shall offer on the altar, 2 lambs, a year a year old, day by day, regularly. One lamb you shall offer in the morning, and the other lamb you shall offer at twilight. And that became something that Israel did throughout their history, both when they had the tabernacle, that great big tent of worship that moved with them, and then when Solomon built the temple, they continued that. And that's what Daniel's referring to here. He's talking about, so he says, when Gabriel visited me, he says, it was about the time of the evening sacrifice. And when you study out this sacrifice, so the purpose was, it was a lamb that was offered every day, twice a day, morning and night, different lamb, offered by the priests as an atonement for the sins of the people of Israel. Now, there was also a day of atonement, which was even more significant in that way. But this was a daily atonement offering. The priests would offer these lambs as a sin offering to God for what the people had done even in that day. Here's what you have to realize, and you probably already see it. The Israelites, when Daniel wrote these words about the evening sacrifice, the Israelites had been living in Babylon for almost 70 years, and there were no evening sacrifices being offered to God. It wasn't happening because they were in a foreign land, and in Babylon, the only gods that people could worship publicly, which included offering sacrifices to them, the only gods they could offer sacrifices to were Babylonian gods. Now, if you were Jewish and you wanted to worship the God of Israel, you could pray to him, but you had to do it privately. You had to do it behind closed doors. You had to do it, in your own home, like Daniel did. He would, of course, open his windows so people could see if they had the right position, but he wasn't out doing anything in public. And certainly Jews were not offering sacrifices to the God of Israel. That was not allowed. They could offer him to Babylonian gods, but not the Jewish God. And again, this had been going on for 70 years. Now, why is that important? Because it tells you something about Daniel. He came to Babylon as a young man, right? And he had spent almost 7 decades, the vast majority of his life, living in Babylon in exile. He spoke its language well enough to become a high government official, meaning he was fluent. He knew the ways of Babylon, otherwise he wouldn't have been elevated to that stage. He had been trained in Babylonian law and customs. But the way that Daniel perceived the world, even down to the ancient equivalent of a wristwatch, whatever it was, right? However you kept track of your day, his way of perceiving the world and the passing of every day, it was still shaped by the Jewish ways he had grown up with in Israel. Let's read verse 21 again. While I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the first time, came to me in swift flight at the time of the evening sacrifice. Daniel, in his mind and in his heart, was Jewish. Sure, he could speak the Babylonian language. He could get along fine in Babylon. He was respected. They gave a lot of credence to what he said. But he wasn't Babylonian. He was one of God's people, in his mind and in his heart. Some months ago, we read a psalm, Psalm 137. We didn't read the whole psalm, but we talked about when the Israelites were first taken captive out of their homeland and they were taken to Babylon, and they were struggling to adapt to this new home, which wasn't home at all, right? And you remember that psalm, Psalm 137, the first 4 verses. It became a popular song several years ago. It says, by the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung our lyres, for there our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth required of us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How will we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? And it's not hard to understand what they're thinking, right? If somebody yanked you out of your home, marched you across a desert to a foreign land where you don't speak the language, you don't know the people, you would have similar feelings of sadness or anger or fill in whatever negative emotion you want, right? How can you be happy? How can you be singing songs when your freedom has been taken and you're stuck, you're trapped in a foreign nation. But the psalm didn't stop there. So it starts talking about, how can we sing the Lord's song? We're weeping, right? But the psalm didn't stop there with just talking about, oh, so sad, poor us, how are we going to make it? It goes on, and it encouraged the people to remember where they came from. That's verses 5 and 6. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. Now, the right hand was symbolic of everything you did, either in warfare or in your trade. In other words, the psalmist is saying, if Jerusalem isn't close to my heart, if I forget who I am, may I be unable to perform the most basic of tasks in my daily life. Your right hand. Everything that you would do centered around your right hand. Then he goes on, verse 6. Let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Now, what is that? Well, picture yourself living in a land that's got a lot of deserts, which Babylon was in what we now call Iraq. Deserts, right? Individual areas of green and lush growth, but for the most part it's dry, sand, wilderness. And when your tongue would stick to the roof of your mouth, that was an ancient image people used to talk about being extremely dehydrated. And if you've ever been in a place like that, which if you've traveled or lived in some parts of the world, you understand what it's like to deal with drought in some areas of the world where there's just no water, and like you can get a level of thirst. I've never been through this myself, but I've been with people who have come through it, and they say when it can be so dry that you just get desperate for a drink, and there's just nothing there. What the psalmist is saying here, he wanted to remember Jerusalem, not the city itself necessarily, but what it represented, the presence of God among his people. And that he was saying, God, if I ever forget you, may I forget what it is that makes me able to do what I do. May my situation become so desperate that I feel like I'm dying in a drought and there's no water. In other words, he always wanted the people to remember, you're not Babylonians. Yes, you're living here. Yes, you're doing your best to move forward and to create a new life, but you're not Babylonians. You're Jews. You're God's people. And that's what he was saying at the end of verse 6. If I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. In other words, there's all these things in the world that I love, but Jerusalem, the presence of God, that's the most important. And I have to believe, based on what Daniel said, how he told the time of day, that's what Daniel was still doing 70 years later. He's an old man. And he had been away for Jerusalem for decades and decades. And the Jewish temple, where those sacrifices used to be made, it wasn't even standing anymore. It had been destroyed. They had to go back and rebuild it later on because it was in rubble. But in his mind, in Daniel's thinking, he measured his day by the schedule of worship in the Jerusalem temple, because that's what he remembered. That was important for him. And he longed to go back to that. He wanted to return to those days. Or even if he didn't live long enough to see it himself, he wanted the people to go back. And so I believe that's why Daniel had this particular favor from God. Again, I'm not saying God loved Daniel more, but there was something about him that caused him to receive God's blessing in a way that other people didn't. And it's because, I think it's because after all these years, he hadn't really changed. When he came to Babylon as a young man, his life was centered around worshiping God. And he had never lost track of that. He could have. He had money. He had power. He was influential. He could have lived the Babylonian dream, whatever that was, right? But he didn't. He was still centered on worshiping God. And he longed and he prayed for the day. He prayed 3 times a day. He longed for the day when the full worship of God would be restored in Jerusalem. And so that's why I think God continually gave him special favor. I think that's why God blessed him so much and gave him these revelations that we're going to get into a little more next week. Daniel was just an unusual man. I wish I was more like Daniel. I pray for it. I really do. Because That would be a wonderful place to be in spiritually, where you're so close to God that even your internal clock isn't so much set by timepieces or cell phones going off with alarms, but just your whole day is centered around God and what He means and how much you love Him. That to me is a wonderful way to live. Amen. So next week we'll get into the more complicated stuff with 70 weeks and all that. But I got some encouragement when I read this, and if I interpreted it right, it's really a wonderful challenge to all of us to live more that way, be closer to God, and seek His blessings by drawing near to Him. Amen.